Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely, let's jump in.
Today we're exploring chapter 15 of the Quran, Al-Hijr,
It's a fascinating chapter, 99 verses.
and it gets its name from the people of Al-Hijr mentioned later in the chapter.
Right, verse 80. But before we get there, let's set the stage a bit.
Yes, good idea. So what is Al-Hijr all about?
Well, the overall structure is really interesting. Some scholars see it as a collection of separate texts kind of pieced together.
Okay, I can see that.
But I think there's a strong argument for a more unified message.
What makes you say that?
There's this really deliberate focus on divine messengers, the way they were received by their people, and what happened to those who rejected them.
Ah, I see. Consequences, a theme we've seen before.
Exactly. And almost all the verses in this chapter rhyme in or vin.
So even the sound of the chapter is part of its message.
Precisely. Creates a sense of unity. And you can really feel it when you read it aloud.
All right, let's get started then. Verse 1, what's going on there?
Well, right off the bat, we encounter those mysterious letters, Alif Lam Ra.
Those are always intriguing.
Yeah, they pop up at the start of a few other chapters, too. No one's quite sure what they mean definitively.
Adds a bit of mystery to it all.
It does. The verse then goes on to mention the signs of the book and a clear Quran.
Okay.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The word kitab, which means book, usually has the definite article al before it.
Right, like the book.
Exactly. But here, the word Quran, meaning Quran, doesn't have it.
That's unusual.
It is. This specific combination is incredibly rare in the Quran. You only see it a couple other times.
Makes you wonder why.
It does. And then there's the description, clear Quran, Quran Mubin. Usually the word Mubin, meaning clear, is used to describe the book. But here it's describing the Quran.
So the emphasis is really on the clarity of the Quran itself.
That's how I see it. Like it's saying, pay attention, this is a clear message for you.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on then. Verses 2 through 5 seem to shift focus a bit.
They do. Now we're talking about the disbelievers. Verse 2 says that they're going to wish they had been Muslims.
Those who disbelieved will wish they had been Muslims. It sounds like regret.
Exactly. And a lot of scholars think this verse is referring to the day of judgment, when it's too late.
When they see the consequences of their actions.
Right. And the way the verse uses the words Muslims, Muslimin, and those who disbelieved, Alladhina kafaru, really highlights this connection between faith and submission to God.
Submission is a key concept, isn't it?
Absolutely. Then in verse 3, God tells the prophet to just leave them be. Leave them to eat and enjoy themselves and to be diverted by false hope, for they will soon know.
So it's about them being distracted by worldly things.
Precisely. Not paying attention to what truly matters. And verses 4 and 5, they really drive home the point that divine justice is inevitable.
We did not destroy any city except that for it was a known decree. And no community can precede its term, nor can they postpone it. There's a certainty to it.
There is. It's laid out. No escaping it.
Okay, verses 6 through 9. What happens there?
Well, now the disbelievers are reacting to the prophet. They're not buying it.
Challenging him, I imagine.
Exactly. In verse 6, they say, "O you to whom the message has been sent down, indeed you are mad."
Classic accusation.
Right. It happened to a lot of prophets. And then in verse 7, they challenge him to, prove it.
Prove that he's a prophet.
Yeah. Why do you not bring us the angels if you should be truthful?
They want to see the angels.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, show us some real proof. But verse 8 shuts that down pretty quickly.
How so?
God says, we do not send down the angels except with truth. And then if they disbelieve, they would not be reprieved.
Meaning the arrival of the angels wouldn't be a good thing. Not for the disbelievers.
Right. It wouldn't be a time for celebration. It would be a time for judgment. No more chances. And then verse 9. Well, that's a powerful statement.
What does it say?
Indeed, it is we who sent down the reminder of the Quran, and indeed, we will be its guardian.
So the Quran is protected from being changed or corrupted. And that takes us to verses 10 through 15.
Here, we're looking at the bigger picture. The history of prophets and messengers.
And how they were received.
Yes. Verse 10 tells us, and we had certainly sent messengers before you to the former nations.
So this isn't a new thing. Sending messengers.
Not at all. It's a pattern. And verse 11 adds, and there did not come to them any messenger except that they ridiculed him.
So rejection is also a pattern.
Unfortunately, yes. People have a hard time accepting those who bring a message different from their own.
They do not believe in it. And already the example of the former peoples has passed. That's verse 13, right?
Yes, it is. And it suggests that people are ignoring history.
They're not learning from the mistakes of the past.
Exactly. And then verses 14 and 15, they offer this really vivid image.
What is it?
Imagine a gate opening up in the sky, and these people are able to ascend, to go up to heaven.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But even then, even with this incredible, impossible sight, they wouldn't believe. They'd say it was magic, that their eyes were bewitched.
That's a powerful statement about how deeply ingrained their disbelief is.
It is.
All right, let's move on to verses 16 through 25. It looks like we're shifting gears again.
We are. Now we're talking about cosmology, creation, and it starts with the heavens.
And we have placed within the sky great stars and have beautified them for the observers. That's verse 16.
Yep, and verse 17 adds, and we have protected them from every devil expelled from the mercy of Allah.
Protected from what?
Well, in verse 18 it describes how any devil who tries to eavesdrop on the heavens to steal a hearing is pursued by a burning flame.
So the heavens are a protected space, guarded.
Exactly.
You mentioned the word expelled or Rajim. What does that mean in this context?
It's a fascinating word, Rajim. It's often translated as expelled, but it can also be understood as stoned or even accuser.
Like Satan being the accuser.
Precisely. And it really sets the stage for the story of Iblis's rebellion, which we'll get to soon. But first, there's this beautiful description of the earth.
What does it say?
Verse 19. And the earth, we have spread it and cast therein firmly set mountains, and caused to grow therein something of everything in due proportion.
And we have made therein means of living for you and for those for whom you do not provide. That's verse 20.
It is. God provides for all creatures, not just humans.
And then there's this emphasis on divine control over everything.
And there's not a thing but that with us are its depositories, and we do not send it down except according to a known measure.
That's verse 21.
Yes, God is in control. And then verse 22 speaks about the winds and the rain, the life-giving forces.
And we have sent the fertilizing winds and sent down water from the sky and given you drink from it, and you are not its retainers.
A reminder that we don't control these essential elements. We're dependent on God's mercy.
And then in verses 23 to 25, God is described as the giver of life and death, the ultimate inheritor, and the all-knowing who will gather all of creation in the end.
It's a powerful reminder of God's ultimate authority.
So we've reached the first major story in Al-Hijr.
The creation of Adam and the rebellion of Iblis, verses 26 through 48.
This is a story that's found in other Abrahamic traditions too, isn't it?
It is. It's a foundational story.
So how does it start?
Well, verses 26 and 27 lay out the creation of humans and the jinn.
Humans from clay and jinn from fire.
Right. Verse 26. And we did certainly create man out of dried clay, from mud molded. And verse 27. And the jinn we created before out of the fire of scorching heat.
And then God creates Adam.
Verse 28. And mention when your Lord said to the angels, indeed, I am going to create a human being out of dried clay from mud molded. And then comes the crucial part, verse 29. So when I proportioned him and breathed into him of my spirit, then fall down to him in prostration.
God commands the angels to prostrate before Adam.
Yes, to acknowledge his special status.
Wow.
And that's where the trouble begins.
Iblis refuses.
Verse 30, so the angels prostrated all of them entirely. But verse 31, except Iblis, he refused to be with those who prostrated.
Why did he refuse?
Well, in verses 32 and 33, God asks him, O Iblis, what prevents you from being with those who prostrated? And Iblis says, I am not one to prostrate to a human being whom you created from dried clay, from mud molded.
He sees himself as superior to Adam because he was created from fire.
Exactly. And that leads to his expulsion.
The punishment.
Verse 34, then get out of paradise, for indeed you are driven out. And verse 35, and indeed upon you is the curse until the day of recompense.
But the story doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't. There's this fascinating back and forth between God and Iblis in verses 36 through 42.
A negotiation of sorts.
Exactly. Iblis asks for a reprieve until the day of judgment. Verse 36. My Lord, then reprieve me until the day they are resurrected.
And God grants it.
He does.
Mhm.
Verse 37. So indeed you are of those reprieved. Verse 38. Until the day of the time well known.
And what does Iblis do with this reprieve?
He sets out to mislead humanity. Verse 39, my Lord, because you have put me in error, I will surely make disobedience attractive to them on earth, and I will mislead them all.
He wants to tempt people away from God.
Exactly. But God makes it clear in verse 40 that Iblis won't have power over everyone, except Among them, your chosen, i.e. sincere servants.
Those who are truly devoted to God.
Right. And God affirms in verse 41, this is a path of return to me that is straight. There's always a way back to God.
What happens in verse 42?
God makes it clear that Iblis only has power over those who choose to follow him. As for my servants, you have no authority over them except those who follow you of the deviators.
So ultimately, it's a matter of choice. Who do we follow?
Exactly. And then the end of this section, verses 43 through 48, paints these vivid pictures of hell and paradise.
The ultimate consequences.
Verse 43, and indeed hell is their promised place, all of them. And verse 44, it has 7 gates. For every gate is a portion of them designated.
7 gates. That's a powerful image.
It is. And then we get this beautiful description of paradise in verses 45 and 46. Indeed, the righteous will be within gardens and springs. It will be said, enter it in peace, secure.
A place of peace and security.
And even more than that, verse 47 says, and we will remove whatever of resentment is in their breasts, so they will be brothers on thrones facing each other.
All negativity gone.
Exactly. And it's eternal, verse 48. No fatigue will touch them therein, nor from it will they ever be removed.
Okay, so that was the first major narrative block. What comes next?
The stories of Abraham and Lot, verses 49 through 75.
The angels visit them.
They do. But first, there's this interesting transition in verses 49 and 50. It's like a reminder of God's nature, both merciful and just.
Inform my servants that it is I who am the forgiving, the merciful, and that my punishment is the painful punishment.
Exactly. Mercy and justice. Both are essential parts of God's character. And then the story of Abraham's guests begins in verse 51. And inform them about the guests of Abraham.
The angels come to him.
Verse 52, when they entered upon him and said, peace, he said, indeed, we are fearful of you.
Abraham is afraid. Why is that?
It's not explicitly stated here, but in other parts of the Quran, it's because they didn't eat. It was unusual.
Oh, I see. It made him suspicious.
Exactly. But then in verse 53, they revealed the good news. They said, fear not. Indeed, we give you good tidings of a knowing boy.
They're announcing the birth of his son, Isaac.
Yes. And Abraham, understandably, is a little surprised. He's old.
Verse 54. He said, do you bring me good tidings when old age has already overtaken me? Then of what do you give me good tidings?
He's doubtful, but the angels reassure him in verses 55 and 56. They say, we bring you good tidings in truth, so do not be of the despairing. And Abraham replies, and who despairs of the mercy of his Lord except for those astray?
He affirms his belief in God's mercy.
He does. And then the story shifts to Lot.
How does that happen?
Well, in verses 57 through 60, there's the smooth transition. Verse 57, he said, then what is your business here, O messengers? Abraham's curious about their purpose.
Why do you tell him?
Verse 58, they said, indeed, we have been sent to a people who are criminals. Verse 59, except the family of Lot, indeed, we will save them all.
They're going to lot to warn him.
And to save him and his family. But there's one exception. Verse 60, except his wife, we have decreed that she will be of those who remain behind.
Lot's wife. What happens to her?
We'll get to that. But first, the angels arrive at Lot's city, verse 61. And when the messengers came to the family of Lot, and Lot is immediately wary, verse 62, he said, indeed, you are people unknown to me.
He doesn't know who they are or why they're there.
Right, and the messengers tell him their purpose in verses 63 and 64. They're bringing punishment. They say, indeed, we bring you that of which they used to doubt, and we have come to you with the truth, and we are surely truthful.
They're there to deliver justice.
Yes. And they tell Lot to leave, verse 65. So set out with your family during a portion of the night and follow behind them, and let not any among you look back, but go on to where you are commanded.
They need to flee the city.
And it's urgent, verse 66. And we conveyed to him, Lot, this decree. Indeed, the last of these people will be cut off at dawn.
So they have to leave before morning.
Exactly. But as they're preparing to leave, Lot's people show up, verse 67. And the people of the city came, rejoicing.
Rejoicing. Why?
Well, it's implied that they were happy about the arrival of Lot's guests. They had bad intentions, and Lot knows this. He tries to reason with them.
What does he say?
Verse 68. He said, indeed, these are my guests, so do not disgrace me. Verse 69, and fear Allah and do not disgrace me.
He's pleading with them to show some respect, to fear God.
He is, but they don't listen. In verse 70, they remind Lot that they'd forbidden him from offering protection to strangers.
And then Lot makes a desperate offer.
Verse 71, he said, these are my daughters if you would be doers of lawful marriage.
He's trying to protect his guests.
He is, and verse 72 describes their state. By your life, indeed, they were blindly wandering in their intoxication.
They were completely lost in their wickedness.
And so the punishment comes, swift and terrible.
Verse 73. So the shriek overtook them at sunrise.
In verse 74, and we made the highest part of it its lowest, and we rained upon them stones of hard clay.
The city was completely destroyed.
Utterly. And verse 75 concludes, indeed, in that are signs for those who discern.
Signs of what?
Signs of God's power, his justice, and the consequences of rejecting his messengers.
Okay, so that's the story of Lot. What happens next?
The chapter continues with the destruction of two more groups, the people of Aykah and the people of Al-Hijr.
Verses 76 through 86.
Exactly. And the story of the people of Al-Aykah starts with this interesting detail. And indeed, their city was on a highway still remaining visible. That's verse 76.
So their city was a prominent landmark.
It was. Verse 77 says, indeed, in that is a sign for the believers. And verse 78 describes them as wrongdoers. And indeed, the companions of the thicket were wrongdoers.
The companions of the thicket, that's a little vague. Who are they exactly?
That's a good question. There's a bit of debate about their identity, but they're clearly marked as wrongdoers. And in verse 79, the punishment comes. So we took vengeance upon them, and indeed, both their cities are on a clear road to this day. It's not entirely clear what it's referring to. Some think it's pointing back to an earlier punishment, perhaps the one mentioned in the story of Lot.
So there might have originally been two separate accounts here.
That's one theory.
Okay, and then we get to the people of Al-Hijr.
Right. Verse 80 introduces them. And indeed, the companions of Al-Hijr denied the messengers. And verse 81 says, and we gave them our signs, but they were turning away from them.
They refused to believe.
They did. And verse 82 describes their dwellings. And they used to carve out of the mountains houses feeling secure.
They felt safe in their mountain homes.
But that safety was an illusion. Verse 83, so the shriek overtook them at morning. And verse 84, and what they had earned did not avail them.
Their worldly possessions couldn't save them.
Not at all.
And then the chapter seems to broaden its scope again.
It does. Verses 85 and 86 speak about the purpose of creation and the coming of the hour, the day of judgment.
And we have not created the heavens and the earth and that between them except in truth. And indeed the hour is coming. So forgive with gracious forgiveness. That's verse 85.
A powerful reminder that everything has a purpose and justice will prevail.
And verse 86 concludes, indeed your Lord, he is the knowing creator.
God is in control. He knows all.
Okay, and that brings us to the final section of Al-Hijr.
Verses 87 through 99.
What are the key themes in this last part?
Well, verse 87 starts with a phrase that has caused quite a bit of debate among scholars. And we have certainly given you, O Muhammad, 7 of the Mathani in the Grand Quran.
7 of the Mathani, what does that mean?
That's the million-dollar question. There are so many different interpretations. Some think it refers to the 7 verses of Surah Al-Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran. Others think it refers to repeated themes within the Quran itself.
Like the stories of the prophets.
Exactly. Or the descriptions of paradise and hell. We just don't know for sure.
It's a mystery.
It is. But the verse clearly links it to the Quran and the Grand Quran.
Okay, and then what?
Verses 88 and 89 offer guidance to the prophet. They say, do not extend your eyes toward that by which we have given enjoyment to certain categories of them, and do not grieve over them, and lower your wing in kindness to the believers. And say, indeed, I am the clear warner.
So he shouldn't be envious of those who disbelieve, and he should continue to warn people.
Exactly. And verses 90 to 93 speak about accountability and divine punishment for those who divide God's message.
And then verse 94 commands the prophet to continue proclaiming the truth.
Right. And verses 95 and 96 offer reassurance. They say, indeed, we will suffice you against the mockers who set up with Allah another deity, so they will know God will protect him.
And verse 97 acknowledges the prophet's struggles, and we know that your breast is constrained by what they say.
He's not immune to the pain of rejection.
And then there's this call to worship in verse 98. So exalt the greatness of your Lord and be of those who prostrate in prayer.
Yes, a reminder to turn to God in all
Now
circumstances.
the final verse.
Verse 99 gives this beautiful, simple instruction. And worship your Lord until there comes to you the certainty that is death.
Worship until the very end.
Exactly. It's a powerful way to end the chapter.
It is. Well, that was quite a journey. Al-Hijr is a really fascinating chapter.
It is. It covers so much ground, from the creation of the universe to the stories of the prophets, and even a glimpse into the afterlife.
And it all ties together.
It does. It's a reminder that everything is connected and God is at the center of it all.
We hope this deep dive has given everyone listening a deeper understanding of this powerful chapter.
Absolutely. And I hope it inspires them to explore it further on their own.
Maybe even read it aloud and experience that beautiful rhythm and rhyme for themselves. Join us next time for another deep dive into the Quran.
I'll be here, ready to dive in.